last video we left off with the Stevens building, which is the second building north of the corner of Quay and Huron on the west side of the street. And we looked at two businesses on the south end of the building. One was Jewel and Justin's and the other one was Mosier's. Before we go to the businesses on the north end of the building, something I'd like to share about this building I think is kind of unique, although not much different than it was with a lot of the buildings in downtown Port Huron. I told you in previous videos that windows are the key to locating businesses. And that's the same case here. If you look in this building, you see four businesses, and each one taking up the space of the two windows above it. That leaves one window in the middle, which was a staircase and a door going to that staircase for the second floor, which was in the middle of the four businesses. However, in this photo from the 80s, you'll see that there's only three businesses in this building. The Jewel and Justin store now takes up four windows. It must have expanded since they previously were there only in the first building, taking up the space of two windows. Next to them is Bell's Hobby Novelty Center. This is the same one that used to be next to the Majestic Theater, and they've moved over here on Huron Avenue now. And then the last of the three businesses, New Vision, was on the north end. Notice that the door going upstairs is still there, available from the sidewalk. In this picture, we're back to the four businesses in this building. Jewel and Justin's is the smaller store now. Before they expanded, just taking up the two window space at the very south end of the building. But notice here that we don't see the door or the stairs anymore. The door should have been between Faulkner's and Peter Johnson's. So how did the people get upstairs? Well, it's a mystery. The next door we want to look at is Peter Johnson's. Peter Johnson's was there for a lot of years, and it's been a shoe store for even more years. Before Peter Johnson's, it was owned by Charles and Thomas Brophy, and they ran a shoe store out of there called Brophy Brothers Shoe Store. They operated out of there from the late 1800s until Peter Johnson's took over in the 1930s. And if you look closely at this photo, you'll see the shoe signage out front of the building. All it says is shoes, but they've been Brophy shoes. The next store was Collinson's ladies' wear store. And you can see from this sign that they sold dresses and hats, among other things, I'm sure. This is a unique story of a young lady by the name of Annie Collinson that started a business over on 7th Street. It was a millinery shop where they sold the hats. This was in 1891, and she probably couldn't have been much older than just a teenager when she started this business. She later expanded over here on Huron Avenue, but she still sold the hats all the time she was in business, it looks like. I noticed when we were looking at Brophy's shoe store that the store right next to it was Annie's store. And she came over and just brought her millinery store with her. She must have expanded into a better selection later on, but when she moved here, it was still a millinery store. The city directories always referred to her as Miss Annie Collinson. I don't know if she ever got married or not, but she was a pretty astute businesswoman to have a business last that long. This block on the west side of the street was known as the Stevens block, and I believe it's still known as the Stevens block today. And as you can see in this directory, they show between Butler and River, or today between Grand River and Quay. However, in this directory, they show the Stevens block as referring to only those stores that were in that building. Herman W. Stevens was the owner of the building, and he was an attorney. Below the first one, you see shows his residence on Military, and then it shows as an attorney he was in an association with Merriam, attorney at law. He eventually teamed up with another attorney by the name of Graham, and later on it became Stevens, Graham, and Stevens, which was possibly his son. Here we have an advertisement for F.D. Sanborn. It looks like a loan company, but it shows it in the Stevens block on Huron Avenue. I've been told that this may be the only commercial building that has been owned by the same family for perhaps 120 years. Stevens had his law offices on the second floor and worked there until he was 100 years old, and he passed away at 105. Today his grandson, Leroy Stevens, has his architectural offices where his grandfather practiced law. Alright, moving to the next building. This is what it looked like in 2009. And this is one of the original buildings. When I say original, I mean from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And again, you look at the windows, you'll see the groupings of 3, 3, and 2. And if you look at this picture right here, you'll see the same grouping. The windows are rounded, but the windows don't lie. It's the same building. You see the groupings of 3, 3, and 2. This is what it looked like in 1980. And you can see the very first business here. It looks like it's gone out of business, vacated. And this was Andy Thomas Menswear. And you can still see the menswear sign in the second section there. All the time I was growing up, this was the only store that was ever at that location. The Andy Thomas here took up 215 and 217 of the Huron Avenue block. Originally, Andy Thomas only occupied the 215 part of the building. 217 was occupied by a theater that you see here. Originally, it was the Ritz Theater, and later on it was called the Lake Theater. Just south of the theater, under the first two windows on this building, was Andrew Thomas Clothing Store. It was entitled just a little bit different than Andrew Thomas Menswear. While you're looking at this picture, look down the block a little bit. It's a good picture of the Mosier clock that was out in front of their jewelry store there, that location. Once you got past the lobby, it looked like the building expanded for the seating and probably took up 215 and 217. The 217 part and probably behind the Andy Thomas store on 215. Here we see that they had talent shows every once in a while, and you can see the talent there up on stage. And here's a theater ad showing what was playing at the time. In this next video clip, you'll get a glimpse of the Ritz Theater. You have to look real quick, and you'll see that the front of it's like white tile. Alright, let's look at this picture again and tell me what you see that's unusual here. Except for a couple men on the fringe, this line is made up all of women. Women and young ladies, girls. I thought, well, with all these women, there must be a heartthrob actor on stage in person. And then looking in this banner, we see that Elliot Forbes is going to be in person. And so I checked out Elliot Forbes. There was no actor by that name except for a much earlier century actor. So who's this Elliot Forbes? Elliot Forbes was billed as the foremost expert on hygiene. Back in those days, we didn't use the word sex, we used the word hygiene. And this movie, entitled Mom and Dad, was all about hygiene. Above the words Mom and Dad, you can see the words Hygiene Super Shocker. And during the intermission, this expert, Elliot Forbes, would discuss hygiene. The movie was about a high school girl's parents that refused to discuss sex education, called personal hygiene in the film with her. She gets pregnant by her boyfriend, who conveniently dies. Her parents are blamed, and the local sex education teacher uses this opportunity to show a film showing the dangers and results of VD in the birth of a baby. Though the film is only about 90 minutes, it was screened with an intermission, one that included a 20-minute lecture by the eminent sexual hygiene commentator Elliot Forbes. The lectures would quickly turn into a sales pitch for books, Mother and Daughters for the ladies, Father and Son for the gentlemen, $1 each or $2 for the set. What a deal. So why were there only women standing in line outside of the theater? Well, because this movie was segregated. Men and women could not sit in the same theater at the same time. And if you look at this ad right here, you can see women only 2 to 7, men only 9 o'clock. And that's with their sons if they wanted to bring them. During Forbes talks, women in nurses' uniforms would troll the aisles selling their booklets. The Forbes kept the money from the book sales. One wonders how Mr. Forbes had the time to give lectures several times a day all across the country during the film's initial road show. Simple. Mr. Forbes did not exist. The producer hired 26 actors to portray him. He was just a character billed as an eminent hygienist who was part of the Mom and Dad show. He would sometimes do radio interviews and make appearances, but his main function was to lecture about sexual hygiene near the middle of the film. The movie would stop and Forbes would take to the stage to talk. In the Afro-American communities inside Chicago, they didn't bother with a famous hygienist. They hired an Afro-American Olympic star, Jesse Owens. Although it faced numerous legal challenges and was condemned by the National Legion of Decency, it went on to become one of the highest-grossing films of the 1940s. Alright, let's get back to the history of 215 Huron Avenue. At one time, before Andy Thomas, there was a Lewis Cass cigar store there. It would appear that Lewis Cass was the name of the cigar, although it appears here that C.E. Mudford is the one that actually produced them, and he had a factory just off of Grand River where he made them. And it appears that this was his retail outlet here in Huron Avenue. It doesn't take much to make some men happy. Give them a cigar and a newspaper and a chair to sit down and all the comforts of home. Matter of fact, that fellow in the middle looks like he's yawning. He's probably already tired from the exercise that he did getting that cigar. Before the cigar store, the J.E. Miller and Son coal office was here. This also shows a picture of their docking facility. Alright, let's look at the north end of this building. And of course, in 1980s, it looked something like this. You can see the vacant Andy Thomas store there on the left, Fantasyland Arcade on the right, and there's a little store in between. That little store was Kay's when I was growing up, and even when I got my first job, it was Kay's. I worked right next door to Kay's. Of course, it was right next to the Ritz Theater. It was a ladies' apparel store, and you can see here it was Kay's wash frocks, so I guess they were washable. And I think this was the smallest store on Huron Avenue. It was very tiny when you went inside. The store you see just north of it is National Credit Clothing. Later became King's Clothing, and later became Fabric Mart. Both King's and Fabric Mart were owned by the same company, and I worked for both of them. When I was 14, my dad told me I had to go to work, so this is where I got my first job. And I just did basic maintenance. I put up the awning every afternoon after school, and when I was about 15, I started working collections. I had a very low voice, and so I made a good bill collector. Matter of fact, after they closed, I transferred over to our Lansing store as a credit manager there. And that was about when I was 20. After Fabric Mart, it became Gazelle Shoes. You can see it here on the left, the signage, and then later became George's Shoes. Way back in 1900, it was far removed from George's Shoes. It was C.F. Taylor's hardware store. This is a photo of the inside of the store. In a 1900 brochure, this is what is said about the store. C.F. Taylor has, by his straightforward way and honest business dealing, built up for himself one of the largest hardware trades in Port Huron. He carries as large a stock as is carried in the city and gives his customer the benefit of his choice and careful buying. He carries one of the largest and noblest line of stoves in the city, and his stock is modern and complete in every department. It will pay the manufacturer to deal with him for his hardware, and the housewife will save money by the superior tinware he handles. I thought we'd finish up the 200 block this video, but I guess not. So hopefully next video we'll finish up this side of the 200 block and perhaps get into the 100 block.